This program is brought to you by Exter. As always, source material will be cited in the corner of the screen throughout the video. Enjoy. In case you were unaware, there exists a small island nation less than 100 miles off the coast of the mainland USA with quite the reputation. A lot is said about this country, and the opinions held about it vary massively. If you listen to those sympathetic to the revolutionary history of Cuba, you'll be told the story of a selfless island nation off the coast of the world's most violent empire that, despite its struggles, which are almost entirely the result of economic warfare waged against it by the United States, gives whatever it can to those in need. Whether that be military assistance to those fighting white supremacists in southern Africa, offering medical aid to others, or even dramatically improving the quality of life domestically relative to the inequality and torture overseen on the island by the previous US-backed dictatorship. But who cares what this guy thinks? I mean, who even is that? These guys are the ones who know what they're talking about.
Cuba is the epicenter, is the headquarters of evil in the Western Hemisphere.
Socialist dictator who murdered all dissidents.
What could you possibly say that's positive about a man like Fidel Castro?
We are sitting in a dangerous predicament.
He actually created a giant gulag and sentenced everybody in the country to stay in it.
Wait, what? No, within just 2 years of the revolution, 200,000 Cubans emigrated, and over 500,000 left during its first decade. And Cuba went on to experience levels of immigration comparable to those of its neighboring countries in the late 20th century. While Cubans did need exit paperwork, and this process was often a bureaucratic mess, one of the main bottlenecks was often the receiving country, especially the US, which restricted legal visas while rewarding undocumented arrivals, seemingly encouraging the kind of dramatic spectacles that could be used for propaganda. And Fidel Castro himself declared the revolution strictly voluntary, and he even facilitated periodic mass exoduses, later agreeing to a US-proposed airlift when dangerous sea departures became common. God damn it, Ben, you make it so hard for me to make a funny little montage when I have to pause and refute your bullshit. It's such a buzzkill.
We are on the edge of war and have been for some time.
He exiled all religious figures.
No, he didn't.
100 years from now, historians are going to look at Fidel Castro and say, this guy was able to supersede Lenin and Stalin.
Under Batista, Cuba was one of the richest countries in Latin America.
Fidel was a genius at evil, and right now they're ending those. Their days are numbered.
Che Guevara said, there's a direct quote from Che, this piece of crap who you see people walking around with his face on t-shirts. It's like walking around again with a Stalin t-shirt. So to send men to the firing squad, judicial proof is unnecessary, is what Che Guevara said. These procedures are an archaic bourgeois detail. This is a revolution, and a revolutionary must become a cold-killing machine motivated by pure hate. We must create a pedagogy of the kereddin, that's the execution law.
This is a fabrication. Che never said this. It's attributed to Che, but in reality, it's the result of splicing together a bunch of random shit to form a blurb he never said nor wrote. In fact, this Frankenstein of a quote is contradicted by the historical record and does not represent Che's actions. For example, he never said judicial proof is unnecessary. In reality, he explicitly warned his judges to be scrupulous about weighing the evidence in each case so as not to give the revolution's enemies additional ammunition, wrote the foremost biographer on Guevara, John Lee Anderson. And the judge who gathered evidence and sat on the appellate bench with Che stated that, "We gave each case due and fair consideration, and we didn't come to our decisions lightly." So again, Ben is lying. There is no primary source to substantiate the claim that this quote was said or written by Che. It doesn't exist, and Che's actions contradict it. Are you going to let me do my montage now, dude?
Che Guevara, worse than Castro, obviously wasn't an official dictator, but what he wanted. Picture Adolf Hitler, who's bad, without the, some would call it, charm.
He asked the Soviet Union to actually nuke the United States.
Che Guevara was less charming than Adolf Hitler.
Mass murdering dictator.
For all of my criticisms of Adolf Hitler, he was punctual.
Summary executions, again, tens of thousands of people murdered.
We're Cuban Americans from Miami.
But in all seriousness, if you live in the West, odds are you've been raised to think the worst about Cuba. From stories of an evil dictator, Fidel Castro, seizing power against the wishes of the population, then stealing everything for himself and plunging what was once a rich and prosperous country into ruin, to tales about the supposedly racist and homophobic revolutionary doctor Che Guevara, who apparently gave up on his Hippocratic oath and decided to Michael Myers his way across the island for no good reason.
Did you know that Che Guevara, was he the Cuban guy?
Well,
Or was that Castro?
Castro was Cuban. Che, he was part of the Cuban Revolution. He wasn't Cuban himself.
Yeah, Che, the revolutionary, he once executed a 12-year-old for being too anti-revolutionary.
That's
Shot him in
crazy.
the face, bro.
Yeah, no, he didn't do that. This is what happens when you get all of your news from either Reddit or ChatGPT. You've surely heard about the poverty and the economic hardships in Cuba, which are supposedly solely the result of godless communist economics and not the blockade levied against Cuba by the United States, one that has been nearly unanimously condemned by the United Nations, with the predictable, consistent exceptions of the Yankees and Israel, though that list has grown in recent years to include other loyal dogs of US imperialism like Javier Milei's Argentina. The point I'm trying to make here is not that Cuba is some perfect paradise. It isn't. It's far from it, and people are suffering. It's true that I myself fall into the camp of Cuba sympathizers, but my goal with this video isn't to sell you the idea that Cuba is a utopia. It's to fill you in on an alternative perspective that gets relentlessly demonized in the West, to maybe challenge some of your preconceptions about the island, and to show you how the real history of Cuba is one of anti-colonial struggle against the world's most brutal empires, and then decades of punishment for successfully throwing off the yoke of imperialism. If I can't get you to change your mind about the country, at the very least, this video will exist to show you who exactly you've been told to despise. You can decide for yourself whether the aggression toward Cuba is warranted, whether it deserves the designation in the United States as a so-called state sponsor of terrorism, or whether the country's economic issues are the result of economic illiteracy or a cruel and frankly genocidal blockade. In the spirit of full transparency, this video will start with the Spanish colonization of Cuba, then move into the period when the United States took over the exploitation, before getting into Fidel Castro's revolution and the relentless sabotage waged against the country by the US. Along the way, I'll be refuting the usual anti-Cuba tropes as they come up. Before we get started, I want to take a minute to thank today's sponsor, Exter. We talk a lot on this channel about valuing things that are built to last as opposed to designed for obsolescence, and Exter actually puts that into practice by making gear for the long haul. Their new Card Holder Pro is made from 100% recycled aluminum, no plastic, so it's eco-friendly, and it comes with a lifetime warranty. It has an upgraded metal ejector trigger that fans your cards out cleanly and makes sure you're never awkwardly fumbling at the checkout again. What really turns this into a full system is the Finder Card, a thin tracker that fits right on top, links to your phone, and makes your wallet effectively unlosable. That peace of mind is huge if you're constantly traveling or out in the field doing research. And for those trips, their Travel Pack Vacuum Kit is a total game changer. It could triple your packing space using anti-rip nylon bags and a portable USB-C rechargeable pump, keeping your gear compressed, organized, and hygienic without adding bulk. Exter is currently running a spring sale until April 13th with up to 45% off. And if you use the promo code OVERZEALOTS, you'll get an extra 20% off for a limited time. Click the link below and shop with confidence knowing that Exter offers a 100-day money-back guarantee. Now let's get back to the video. In 1492, the infamous colonizer Christopher Columbus came in contact with and reported on the existence of a beautiful island we now know as Cuba. It wasn't actually Columbus who launched the conquest of Cuba, and it wouldn't be for another 19 years until somebody did. And that someone was a Spanish conquistador by the name of Diego de Velázquez, who invaded and started the Spanish colonization of the island in 1511. Prior to his conquest, Cuba was inhabited by multiple groups indigenous to the Americas. The earliest to arrive on the island were the Guanahatabes, migrants from the forests of northern South America who lived hunter-gatherer lifestyles. Soon after came the Siboney, and then the Taíno. The Taíno made up the majority of the population by the time of contact with the Spanish, were skilled agriculturalists and very hospitable, according to Spanish accounts. They cultivated yucca root, which they baked into cassava bread, grew cotton, tobacco, and lived in houses known as bohíos, structures designed so efficiently that Spanish settlers were quick to copy them, and which remain a feature of Cuban architecture today. In fact, the very name Cuba comes from the Taíno language. Now, the reason I'm telling you all of this is to weed out the presumptions that many Westerners hold about indigenous societies and the perceived superiority of the European way of life. The truth is, fruitful, ingenious, and rich indigenous cultures have existed all over the world prior to European settler colonialism, and unfortunately, many of us will never know about them. The arrogance of the colonizer is such that replacing a rich indigenous culture with a system of colonial looting and slavery is somehow branded as an improvement, and in some cases, portrayed as a great favor done to the colonized peoples. But that isn't true. In Cuba's case, the immense suffering inflicted on the island stands as a direct testament to the ills of colonialism and the post-colonial legacy it left behind. Once the Spanish took over the island, they enacted the encomienda system. As historian Greg Grandin explains in his book, America, America, The encomienda system, in the context of the Americas, refers to a kind of slavery, but indios encomendados, or commended Indians, weren't considered private property or chattel. Rather, they were formerly something like wards, members of an existing village or community who, in exchange for labor, were to receive instruction in Christian doctrine from their overlords, their guardian encomenderos. The encomienda was important, but it was just one of many coerced labor systems. As the indigenous workforce began to deplete due to mistreatment and disease, the Spanish, starting in the 1520s, began bringing over African slaves in large numbers to fill their roles. By the late 1700s, in response to the sugar boom, huge waves of enslaved Africans were brought to Cuba to work on sugar plantations. This sharpened the class contradictions, exacerbated racial stratification, and solidified Cuba as a racial slave state. For those who may be unfamiliar, the Spanish imposed brutal racial hierarchies in their colonies. In Cuba, it looked roughly like this. Peninsulars, white Spaniards born in Spain, were at the top. Below them were Creoles, the descendants of Spanish colonizers born in the Americas. And beneath them were indigenous and African peoples, with free people of color, which Cuba had a relatively large number of, placed above enslaved Africans. While the Spanish originally envisioned their colonies as a binary system of two legally distinct republics, the Republic of Spaniards and the Republic of Indians, as they referred to it, this framework fell apart fairly quickly, especially in Cuba's case, where, largely due to the massive decline of the indigenous population, the mass importation of enslaved Africans, and mixing between all these groups, it devolved into a weird and gross caste system based on blood and lineage, where proximity to blackness placed you lower in the social order. By the mid to late 1800s, the Creoles, the descendants of the Spanish born in Cuba, started to sharpen their nationalist movements and aimed to fight off the Spanish-born peninsulars, who had monopolized power. Much of this movement was largely concerned with maintaining the existing social order, but just swapping the peninsulars at the top with the Creoles, the Cuban-born elites. Even when the 10 Years' War for Independence began in 1868, led by plantation owners who wanted to boot out the Spanish, the movement was conflicted over issues like slavery and maintaining the existing social order. There was, however, a Creole by the name of José Martí who despised the racial stratification and sought to unite Cubans of all races in one national liberatory struggle for independence. Martí formed the Cuban Revolutionary Party in 1892 with the goal to unite the fractured independence movements in the country, and by 1895, the final war for Cuban independence from the Spanish began. In just 3 years, the rebels, whom Martí was no longer a part of as he died early in battle, had so badly beaten the Spanish that they were on the verge of collapse. Cuban independence was closer than ever, but the rebels failed to consider one very important thing: the audacity of the United States. See, the US had long coveted the island and wanted to take it over from the Spanish. You can see figures as old as Thomas Jefferson and John Quincy Adams fantasizing about this. The US is also notorious for playing dirty, and its meddling in 1898 stripped the hard-earned victory away from the Cuban rebels. As Grandin recounts the story, white and black Cubans fought side by side, with free people of color and former slaves obtaining the highest military ranks. Black officers commanded ordinary soldiers of lighter skin, marching through the Cuban countryside, taking over plantations, setting cane fields ablaze, and occupying villages and cities. In the years after Martí's death, Spain's army had fallen back, disordered and demoralized. There was little doubt that the insurgents would win. Then, on February 15, 1898, the gunpowder magazines on board the USS Maine exploded, killing most of its crew and sinking the ship, which had been anchored in Havana's harbor. President William McKinley used the explosion, which he blamed on Spain, as a pretext to enter the war, dispatching the U.S. Navy to Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Cuba. United States troops easily took Spain's island colonies and, in Cuba, shunted aside the rebel army. A new government, supervised by a military staff that included ex-Confederates like Fitzhugh Lee, Robert E. Lee's nephew, imposed a system of racial segregation roughly based on the model of the post-Reconstruction South. Washington kept Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, but granted nominal independence to Cuba. The United States did insist that the new republic include in its constitution a clause called the Platt Amendment after Connecticut Senator Orville Platt that granted the United States the right to intervene in the nation's affairs at will. So, to summarize, The Cuban War for Independence from Spain was fought by Cuban rebels of all different backgrounds, united by a shared goal of long overdue liberation and equality. They did all the heavy lifting and brought the Spanish to the brink of collapse. The US then used an explosion on one of its ships as a pretext to declare war on Spain, took over Cuba, and occupied it until 1902, sidelined and disbanded the multiracial independence army, who again did all the work, imposed some white supremacists who installed another system of racial segregation, and added a constitutional amendment stipulating that the US could intervene in Cuba however the fuck it wants at any time. Nice. So at this point, the Spanish are out, and the new Cuban Constitution of 1901 gives the Yankees the ability to militarily intervene in Cuba whenever they want, control Cuba's foreign and economic policies, and seize land for US naval bases. This neocolonial control over Cuba allowed for US corporate interests to get extremely rich at the expense of the vast majority of the island's inhabitants. As Aviva Chomsky puts it in her book on the matter, Cuban politics remained hostage to the United States, while US companies and investors took control of the major sectors of Cuba's economy. By 1905, 60% of Cuba's rural land was owned by US citizens or companies. US investors also controlled 90% of Cuba's tobacco trade, the country's iron, copper, and nickel mines, its railroads, and its electricity and telephone systems. And things only got worse from there. She goes on to elucidate the state of Cuba on the eve of the revolution that brought Castro's government to power. One could say that there were at least two Cubas in the 1950s. One was the 1.5 million who were jobless or who belonged to the rural poor, including landless workers and campesinos with small plots. These impoverished Cubans survived mostly on rice, a few beans, and sugar water, creating the naked children, their swollen stomachs testifying to an unbalanced diet and infection from parasitic worms that sociologist Lori Nelson found everywhere in rural Cuba in 1950. At the other end of the spectrum, the 900,000 or so wealthiest Cubans controlled 43% of the country's income. These were the people who had money to spend on frequent shopping jaunts to Miami, luxurious air-conditioned homes, and even mausoleums complete with elevators, air conditioners, and telephones, to make sure they continued to enjoy a high level of comfort in the afterlife. In between, another 3.5 million struggled to make ends meet. What was it that this little guy was saying again?
Under Batista, Cuba was one of the richest countries in Latin America. It was on the upswing.
All right, dude, sure. Cuba's close integration with the US economy meant that almost everything Cubans bought was imported from the United States, and the cost of living was as high or higher than in the United States. But Cuban wages were much lower, and Cubans had none of the social services and guarantees that US citizens enjoyed. Cuba was forced into an all-too-familiar position of dependency, where it would export its raw materials just to import manufactured goods from the imperial core that cost more than it made through its exports. Its resources were coveted and appropriated by the US. Vast tracts of Cuban land were held in reserve by American companies, leaving them idle while Cubans remained landless and hungry. Now, in order for the US to maintain this dynamic of subjugating the majority of the Cuban population for the benefit of a slim portion of Cuban elites and US companies, it installed a comprador government in Cuba to remain friendly to US interests. That's where this man, Fulgencio Batista, comes into the story. A little context. In 1933, a nationalist government came into power in Cuba, and among other progressive things, it abrogated the Platt Amendment. Remember that thing that gave the US the ability to do whatever it wanted with Cuba? Well, this was unacceptable to the Americans, who were disgusted at the thought of Cubans manufacturing their own destiny, so US officials began conspiring with the Cuban military officer by the name of Batista. U.S. Ambassador Sumner Welles privately cultivated Batista, suggesting to him that the very great majority of the commercial and financial interests in Cuba who are looking for protection could only find such protection in himself, and that the United States would look approvingly on an overthrow of the revolutionary government. Batista took him up on that offer. He forced the sitting Cuban president to resign, replaced him with a conservative, and in January of 1934, with U.S. support, he began ruling Cuba from behind the scenes as the Army Chief of Staff, propping up various civilian presidents to serve as his face. As Aviva Chomsky summarized, directly or behind the scenes, Batista would remain a power maker until 1959. From 1934 to 44 and 1952 to 59, Batista was the ultimate authority in Cuba. And that latter reign of his, the one that started in 1952, saw him return to power by force in a coup and establish a brutal US-backed dictatorship, sparking the Cuban Revolution. This is a CIA document comparing the brutality of Fulgencio Batista's regime with the rule of Fidel Castro. It goes on to point out that tens of thousands of individuals were murdered by Batista's regime, that his forces had killed on a whim, and that the anti-Batista forces in the country had the support of up to 90% of the population by 1958. And crucially, it goes on to write that the large-scale campaigns of murders and terrorism characteristic of the last years of the Batista regime have not occurred during the Castro regime. Even JFK commented in a 1960 speech, "Fulgencio Batista murdered 20,000 Cubans in 7 years, a greater proportion of the Cuban population than the proportion of Americans who died in both world wars." The reason I tell you this is to challenge the narrative that many of us are fed about the Cuban Revolution and to show that the vast majority of the population supported Che, Castro, and the rebels, and that the true bloodthirsty tyrant in Cuba was the guy that the Americans propped up. I mean, Batista's ruthless secret police force, the Bureau for the Repression of Communist Activities, was straight up funded and advised by the CIA. To quickly remind you before we go any further, the state of Cuba prior to the revolution was one where the US had essentially transformed it into a playpen for American companies and elites to get rich at the direct expense of the majority of Cubans who were exploited by this setup. As the renowned journalist John Lee Anderson wrote, by the mid-1950s, Cuba was earning a reputation where weekend Americans came to gamble, drink, and carouse with Havana's many prostitutes. A notorious character named Schwartzman ran a theater featuring hardcore blue films and live sex performances, and the American crime syndicates were moving in as well, opening nightclubs and gambling casinos, all at a time where the majority of Cubans were suffering immensely. Now, this segment of the video is not going to be me portraying Cuba as some sort of utopia and acting like everything was smooth sailing the second the rebels took over. It's going to be an honest assessment of Cuba's conditions pre-revolution and how they improved in the years that followed. But first, let's rewind a bit and tell the story of how the revolution came to be. In the wake of Batista's 1952 coup and the subsequent US recognition of his government, a new generation of young activists became directly radicalized. They saw not only their hopes of democracy crushed, but also the US support and co-sign of Batista's tyrannical rule, prioritizing its anti-communist obsession over the well-being of Cubans. One of the individuals radicalized during this time was a young lawyer by the name of Fidel Castro, who, tired of operating strictly through legal means in the face of a dictator who couldn't care less about rules and laws, began embracing armed struggle as a way to achieve liberation. Forgive me if I'm jumping forward a bit here, but it's worth noting that Fidel Castro was not originally a communist or even all too hostile to the US. He was an economic nationalist who didn't want to see Cuba ripped off and exploited. This was fully understood by US officials who noted that Castro was appointing relatively conservative and even anti-communist figures to his government once he assumed power, but I'm getting ahead of myself. On July 26, 1953, so just a year after Batista came to power in a coup, Castro led roughly 160 rebels in an attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, hoping to ignite a mass popular uprising. Militarily, it was a mess. The revolt failed, and many of the rebels were captured, tortured, and executed. Fidel and his brother Raul were imprisoned, but Fidel used the trial as a platform. He delivered his now famous "History will absolve me" speech, and he went on to lay out a political platform that would later become the basis of the revolution. He laid out the 5 revolutionary laws that the Moncada attackers intended to implement: restoration and implementation of the 1940 Constitution, an agrarian reform putting land in the hand of those who tilled it, obligation of employers to share profits with workers, guaranteed markets for small sugar farmers, and confiscation of all enterprises obtained through fraud and corruption. All of these revolutionary laws, he emphasized, were based on the Constitution itself, which restricted large land holdings and provided labor rights, wrote Chomsky. Following a public amnesty campaign, Fidel and his brother were released in May 1955 and formally founded the July 26th movement, named in commemoration of their 1953 Moncada attack. They then went into exile in Mexico to regroup and reorganize, where they met new revolutionaries, including the legendary Ernesto Che Guevara. and began solidifying the movement. In November of 1956, 82 rebels crowded onto the yacht Granma and sailed for Cuba. Disaster greeted the landing. Delayed, ambushed, and nearly wiped out, a small handful of survivors managed to retreat into the Sierra Maestra mountain range in southeastern Cuba. From there, the revolution expanded on two fronts, the Sierra and the Llano. The Sierra referred to the war waged by mountain guerrilla fighters, while the Llano referred to the struggle in the cities, where an urban underground initiated strikes, carried out sabotage, and engaged in armed resistance against the regime. As the rebels waged war from the Sierra Maestra, they began to gain the trust of the peasantry, who had been horrifically neglected by the Batista regime and suffered from diseases, poverty, illiteracy, and landlessness. The rebels, by treating these people with respect, treating them medically, and even teaching them to read, created a vital and expansive network for intelligence and new recruits. In April of 1958, the revolutionary movement engaged in a general strike with the hopes that it would topple the dictator, but it failed. This failure actually emboldened Batista and gave him the confidence to launch a massive offensive in the hopes that he could finally crush the insurgency. He sent 10,000 troops with tanks and air support after the rebels in the Sierra Maestra. Amazingly, despite being hugely outnumbered and utilizing inferior weaponry, the rebels, due to their discipline and familiarity with the terrain, defeated Batista's army. The Battle of El Gig in July of 1958 saw an entire army battalion surrender to the rebels and marked the end of Batista's offensive. In late 1958, rebel forces, led by Che Guevara, seized Santa Clara and smashed what was left of the regime. Batista fled on January 1st, 1959, as the rebels entered Havana to enormous popular support, marking a complete triumph of the revolution. As Aviva Chomsky writes in regards to the popularity of the revolution, the Cuban population was overwhelmingly supportive of the new government and its reforms. The only opposition came from close supporters of Batista and members of his military, and property holders whose properties were threatened. As U.S. opposition to Castro cemented, his popularity in Cuba remained strong. U.S. policymakers needed to consider the continued emotional attachment to Fidel Castro as a national symbol by the bulk of the Cuban people, as well as the continued belief by virtually all Cubans in the need for social and economic changes embodied to date only in Castro's revolutionary program.
Fidel Castro ruled his people through what? Through fear.
Did your friend from Miami tell you that?
1 million machete-wielding peasants jammed the square before Cuba's national capital in response to the call of Fidel Castro for a celebration of the 6th anniversary of his 26th of July revolutionary movement. It is perhaps the greatest mass rally ever staged in the Western Hemisphere, a telling demonstration of Castro's sway over the Cuban masses.
Fidel Castro ruled his people through what? Through fear.
With all that said, the story of the Cuban Revolution is one of united struggle against a tyrannical despot. Guerrilla fighters stationed themselves in the mountains, cared for the peasantry by treating them with dignity, teaching them to read and fight, providing medical aid, and awakening class consciousness, while agents in the cities carried out strikes and sabotage in a coordinated effort to topple the regime. It's a story of solidarity, revolutionary struggle, and liberation. The kind of shit you'd expect Americans to find cool given their own history and romanticization of their revolution. In fact, the Cuban one was way cooler. It was rooted in social reforms, alleviating extreme poverty, and fighting imperialism. The Americans, by contrast, fought the British so that they could keep genociding the natives to the west of the original 13 colonies, but that's another story, and a crude oversimplification, I'll admit. But the point is, when the topic turns to Cuba, those in the upper echelons of Western society refuse to show it any grace or charity, even though its history is one of colonialism, whether Spanish or the US neocolonialism that followed, and revolutionary struggle for liberation. We've grown so accustomed to pointing at Cuba and mocking it for its relative poverty for political points that we fail to see that we're laughing at the way it survives while our countries strangle it, to paraphrase that Castro quote. So for this segment, I'll dedicate some time to highlighting all that Cuba has achieved and all the selflessness it shows to countries in need. I know things are looking bleak in Cuba right now, largely due to the US blockade. I don't think I need to remind you about the negatives when that's all the Western media loves to go on about. Instead, let this video serve as a counterbalance that highlights all that's commendable about post-revolutionary Cuba. Immediately upon taking over, the new Cuban revolutionary government got to work implementing the Moncada program, making good on Castro's platform outlined back during his trial in '53. Cuba at this time was suffering from immense income inequality exacerbated by the years of colonialism, neocolonialism, US-backed dictatorship, and a collaborationist comprador Cuban elite. As we've already seen, those who aimed to diminish the results of the Cuban Revolution loved to claim that prior to Castro, Cuba was a rich country.
Cuba had in 1958, the year before Castro took over, the highest standard of living of any Latin American country and half of Europe.
However, this is the same old dishonest bullshit said about many pre-revolutionary societies where the riches are funneled straight to the upper echelons while the masses live in squalor. To quote Vijay Prashad and Noam Chomsky on the matter, a study by professors in Havana from 1957 noted, the city of Havana is living in an epoch of extraordinary prosperity while in the countryside, people, especially the agricultural workers, are living in sluggish, miserable, and desperate conditions too difficult to believe. That is why the new revolution's agrarian reform law was so eagerly anticipated. See, one of the ways the revolutionary government tackled this issue of inequality was by limiting land holdings and redistributing land to the peasantry. Contrary to what you may have heard, Castro did offer compensation for this. These agrarian reforms not only broke up the latifundia, huge estates controlled by a small, typically white elite whose power flowed directly from colonial-era land structures, but also led to the expropriation, again with compensation, and redistribution of the vast arable land hoarded by foreign companies to the detriment of the Cuban masses. To quote Arnold August's Cuba and Its Neighbors, according to a 2008 U.S. Department of Agriculture report, in the late 1950s, U.S. interests owned 75% of the arable land. The end result of these land reforms was the distribution of land to over 100,000 landless farmers who had previously lived in poverty. Aside from the land reforms, Castro's government emphasized the need for human services and more radical change, and they wasted no time getting going. The urban reform law of 1960 set rents to no more than 10% of a family's income, mortgage rates were cut, landlords were forbidden to evict their tenants, and the owners of urban land were obliged to sell vacant sites at low prices to anyone planning to build a house, wrote historian Richard Gott. Utility rates for electricity, transport, and telephone services were slashed to make them more affordable for the working class. Real wages increased by about 15%, and social services were quickly expanded to include free schooling, healthcare, medicine, water, social security, burial services, and more. In 1961, the government took massive strides to combat illiteracy, and according to historian Paco Ignacio Taibo II, the results were spectacular. 707,000 people had been taught to read and write, and only 3.9% of the population was illiterate after just 2 years of revolution and just one mass campaign. I feel like when it comes to judging the progress made by a developing country, some of us have this tendency to compare it to imperialist Western nations and then mock it for being relatively behind. But that's not exactly fair, is it? These countries don't have centuries of colonial plundering under their belts to thank for their wealth. They were on the receiving end of that brutal structure all this time. Shouldn't we be comparing these countries to A, where they started from, and B, their neighbors? In the case of Cuba, the improvements were astonishing. Take the aforementioned health services as an example. Prior to the revolution, things were atrocious. Rural infant and maternal mortality rates were the second highest in Latin America, noted professor of Latin American political economy, Helen Jaffe. So when our annoying little friend over here recites the claim that Cuba's infant mortality rate was actually already low prior to Castro,
here's the Wall Street Journal. The Cuba that Castro inherited was developing but relatively prosperous and ranked third in Latin America in doctors and dentists and daily calorie consumption per capita. Its infant mortality rate was the lowest in the region.
He's operating on skewed data, where the affluent parts of Cuba mess up the numbers and mask the brutal inequality and suffering in the rural parts. Jaffe goes on to write, some 80% of children in the countryside suffered intestinal parasites in 1959. It was the number one cause of death, and 60% of the rural population was seriously undernourished. Life expectancy in rural areas was 50 years, 60 nationally. There was only one rural hospital, only 4% of rural Cubans ate meat, only 3% had bread, less than 20% had eggs, only 2% had running water, 9% had electricity, and as Jaffe goes on, the true enemy of public health, a report noted, was economic underdevelopment, feudal exploitation, the latifundia plantation system, and its consequences. Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and the revolutionary government remedied this. They established the rural medical services to provide those suffering in the countryside with aid so that no one was left sick, dying, and forgotten anywhere in the country. A free, universal healthcare system was created. Infant mortality dropped to under 10 deaths per 1,000 live births by the 1990s and to under 5 deaths by 2017, a rate lower than that of the much richer United States and 10 times lower than Cuba's closest neighbor, Haiti. This represented a significant improvement over pre-revolutionary Cuba, where infant mortality stood at 60 per 1,000 live births overall and 100 per 1,000 in rural areas. Not to mention that maternal mortality was 120 deaths per 100,000 births, with only half of all births in the country taking place in hospitals in the 1950s. By the 1990s, 99% of births were taking place in hospitals. Life expectancy has soared from nearly 60 years before the revolution, when there were only around 6,000 physicians, mostly stationed in Havana, to nearly 80 years today, with over 70,000 physicians spread across the entire country, as is noted in Pedro Ross's How the Workers' Parliaments Saved the Cuban Revolution. Thanks to a national immunization campaign that began in 1962, the Cuban government was able to radically combat disease. Polio was eradicated that same year, malaria in 68, diphtheria in 71, measles in 93, rubella in 95, and so on and so forth. And when we compare Cuba's economic performance to that of its Latin American contemporaries, it substantially outperformed them, especially during the 70s and 80s. To be specific, between 1970 to 1988, Cuba enjoyed an annual economic growth rate that averaged 4.1%, while the comparable growth figure for Latin America during that time was just 1.2%. In the 80s, the rest of Latin America suffered an extreme debt crisis that caused the region's overall GDP to plummet by almost 10% between 1981 and 1984, while Cuba experienced an economic boom at that time with an annual average growth rate of 7.3%. It wasn't until Cuba's trading partners ceased to exist and the US economic warfare intensified that Cuba began to suffer substantially. But we'll get to that later. First, we haven't even touched on the social improvements in the wake of the Cuban Revolution. Castro's government immediately banned all forms of racial discrimination in private and public life. Prior to the revolution, Cuba had segregated beaches, clubs, schools, and so forth. The revolutionary government outlawed this while promoting gender equality and the integration of women into the workforce. Now, if I were to tell you, my mostly Western audience, that post-revolutionary Cuba also boasts a unique form of participatory democracy, odds are a good amount of you wouldn't believe me. And that's fine. Again, I'm not here to pretend that Cuba is perfect or that they have everything figured out, but rather to challenge your preconceptions, specifically about democracy and what actually constitutes it. In the West, particularly in the US, democracy seems to be something people do once every 4 years, where they go out and vote for one of 2 corrupt politicians from 2 corrupt parties, all while their material realities steadily decline over time, and it seems as though fundamental change never comes, no matter how badly the populace wants it. Take universal healthcare in the US, for example. The masses want it, it's a popular demand, but no matter the color tie on the president, it never comes. As the saying goes, in America you could change the party, but not the policy. In a place like Cuba, sure, you have one party that serves as an ideological vanguard, but the policies can actually be changed, and the masses can exert some form of control on a grassroots level. That's why, as Arnold August notes, Cuba is an example of democracy in motion, as opposed to the stagnant, decrepit bullshit that takes place in the US. And in case you don't believe me, I'll quickly explain how the system of participatory democracy looks in Cuba. Right off the bat, it's worth mentioning that many Cubans reject the imposition of multi-party systems and argue that before 1959, Cuba had political parties, but no democracy. A direct rebuttal to the idea that the two are inextricably linked. But before we get into that, we should probably lay some groundwork and talk about what democracy even is and why it's important. Aviva Chomsky, in her book A History of the Cuban Revolution, has a great succinct passage that perfectly describes how a fully fleshed out democracy should look. It goes like this. In essence, democracy has to do with systems or mechanisms for the people of a society to be involved in making decisions about how their society will function. Political scientists distinguish between representative and direct democracy. In a representative democracy, People participate in decision-making by electing representatives to make the actual decisions. In a direct democracy, decisions are made by some sort of collective assembly in which all can participate. And in Cuba, the latter reigns through direct citizen involvement, mass organizations, and a unique electoral structure. Elections are held at the municipal, provincial, and national levels, and the Communist Party of Cuba, the PCC, does not nominate or run candidates. Money plays no role in Cuban elections, no advertising, no campaigning, just a one-page biography of each candidate posted publicly. The general election process is divided into two distinct phases. Phase 1 covers municipal elections. In small neighborhood districts, residents gather in open assemblies to directly nominate candidates from among themselves by a show of hands. Citizens then elect delegates to the municipal assemblies via secret ballot. Once constituted, these local municipal assemblies elect their own president and vice president from among their ranks. Phase 2 covers national elections for the National Assembly of People's Power. For these seats, candidates are proposed by candidacies commissions, made up of representatives from mass organizations such as trade unions, student groups, and the Women's Federation, rather than directly by neighborhood assemblies. To ensure the national government remains anchored to the grassroots, up to 50% of these national deputies are the local municipal delegates who were already elected by their neighborhoods in Phase 1. Ultimately, this creates a participatory, bottom-up democratic system. So by now you might be wondering, if the PCC isn't involved in elections, what's its purpose? Well, it exists as an ideological vanguard. Influenced largely by the ideas of José Martí, who believed in a single unifying party to defend Cuba against foreign domination, the PCC guides the overall political and economic orientation of the country, but refrains from taking over administrative procedures or participating in the electoral process. And Cuba's democracy in motion goes beyond voting and includes massive networks of civil organizations. These organizations are embedded directly in the political system and have the constitutional right to initiate legislation, stabilize the economy during crisis, and more. For example, in the 1990s, after the USSR dissolved, over 80,000 workers' parliaments collectively formulated strategies to reorganize production and save the Cuban economy. But the most telling feature of Cuban democracy, in my opinion, is the grassroots legislative consultations. In Cuba, major national policies undergo extensive grassroots deliberation and amendment before they can be passed. As August wrote in reference to Castro's relationship with the citizenry, this is groundbreaking in the annals of revolution, whereby leaders publicly exchange with the people in mass meetings and a dialectic bond is created in order to make decisions. A clear example of this principle in action is the 2008 Social Security Bill, which was debated in over 85,000 local workers' assemblies by more than 3 million people. Citizens' input directly shaped and amended the bill until it reflected the wishes of the masses. As a result, pensions were recalculated in a way that was more favorable to workers than what was originally proposed in the bill's first draft. The 2011 economic guideline reforms were debated by about 9 million people in over 160,000 meetings, which resulted in 68% of the guidelines being modified before being adopted. And the list goes on. My apologies if this part of the video feels dry or boring or too analytical, but I think it's important to show how democracy can take a different shape than what we see in the US, and how it can produce more meaningful results. In Cuba, there's a highly decentralized electoral system paired with massive ongoing public consultations that give everyday Cubans veto power and the ability to amend the laws and economic plans that affect them. In the US, by contrast, you get to vote between Epstein's friend in red or Epstein's friend in blue. And yes, there are still shortcomings with the way things are in Cuba. That's why democracy is understood as a process and something that is ongoing and in motion, not just something that happens every 4th November, where you vote for the lesser evil. In April of 1960, a U.S. Internal State Department memo, colloquially referred to as the Mallory Memorandum, boasted the subject line, "The Decline and Fall of Castro," and it explicitly stated that the majority of Cubans supported Castro, that there was no effective political opposition in Cuba, and that U.S. military intervention would only cause Castro to become even more popular. The memo goes on to explain how the U.S. would go about achieving its goal of destroying Cuba so that its corporations can get back to plundering it the way they had for so many years prior. The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. Every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba, it reads. Then it calls for denying Cuba money and supplies, openly fantasizes about falling real and monetary wages, and explicitly seeks to induce hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of Castro. Typically, when we talk about Cuba, people love to blame communism as though it were the primary cause of the island's suffering, supposedly doomed to fail because of its inherent futility. But if communism were destined to collapse on its own, why did U.S. officials feel the need to go all out like this? And to be clear, everything laid out in that memorandum was eventually carried out by the U.S. Remember how earlier I mentioned that the Cuban revolutionary government carried out land reform programs where vast tracts of often uncultivated arable land, hoarded by foreign companies and the descendants of slave-owning Cuban elites, were redistributed to the peasantry? Well, this is often cited as one of the main causes of economic tension between the US and Cuba. People point to this and claim that the evil communist dictator Fidel Castro stole property from the US and the Cuban land-owning elite, but in reality, Castro offered compensation for everything he expropriated, acted within the legal limits of Cuba's own 1940 constitution, which allowed confiscation for the public good and explicitly prohibited large land holdings, and he did so to reclaim land hoarded by foreign companies to the direct detriment of the Cuban people. If this sounds like some alien communist concept, I'd encourage you to look at your own country's eminent domain laws, which allows the state to confiscate private property when it deems it necessary. I'd argue that the situation in Cuba, where the majority of arable land was held either by foreign companies, leaving much of it idle, or by some asshole who earned his acreage by inheriting a plantation from a slave-owning granddaddy while the masses lived in squalor, was more than enough justification for this policy. And again, Castro offered compensation. Other major Western countries, Canada, Spain, Switzerland, the UK, France, all negotiated with Fidel and accepted his terms. The United States was the exception. It refused to negotiate, shot the offer down, and claimed that Castro wasn't offering adequate compensation. Well, then let's talk about how Fidel's government actually came up with this compensation plan. He offered to compensate those whose property he expropriated with 20 to 29-year government bonds carrying a 4.5% interest rate. The amount of compensation was based directly on the value the owners themselves had declared on their tax returns. U.S. companies and Cuban elites were outraged by Castro's offer and perceived it to be an undercut because they had been systematically undervaluing their land for years to pay less in taxes. All Fidel did was take them at their word about what their property was worth. Another major catalyst for tensions between the US and Cuba was the fact that Cuba signed a lucrative trade deal with the Soviet Union in 1960, where the Cubans would trade sugar for Soviet oil and goods. In response to this agreement, American oil companies operating in Cuba and acting on advice from Washington refused to process Soviet petroleum. This move caused Castro to expropriate and nationalize the refineries. Now, in case you think that Castro had no legal right to do this, you would be wrong. As Salim Lamrani wrote in The Economic War Against Cuba, where he touches on the legality of Castro's expropriations, they were carried out in accordance with international law that grants any nation the sovereign right to nationalize companies operating on its territory in exchange for compensation. And as we've already been over, when it came to Castro's nationalizations, his government put forth plans to compensate those whose property was affected. Other Western governments and companies came to an agreement with him. The US stubbornly refused to negotiate. Quote, all of the nations affected by the expropriation process negotiated with the Cuban government and accepted global compensation agreements, all with the exception of the United States. The Eisenhower administration demanded, as a minimum standard, an indemnification rapid, adequate, and effective for the nationalization of U.S. assets. However, this procedure is not recognized by international law, which prohibits a third country from imposing conditions on sovereign nations, that is to say, involving itself in that nation's internal affairs. Anyway, this move by Castro led the Eisenhower administration to cut Cuba's sugar quota and eventually impose a trade embargo on Cuba in October of 1960. By 1961, the U.S. severed all diplomatic relations with the island. Now, all of these specifics are important to know, but honestly, I'm of the opinion that there was really nothing the Cubans could have done to avoid the wrath of the United States government. As the previously mentioned April 1960 Mallory Memorandum made clear, well before Castro nationalized the oil refineries in June of that year, The US goal was to deliberately inflict economic destruction and hardship on Cuba in order to overthrow the new government. CIA officials themselves acknowledged that Castro was originally appointing anti-communists to his government, that he wasn't an unreasonable man, that he wasn't anti-American, and that he could be worked with. But none of this was enough because at the end of the day, the goals of the Cuban Revolution were to implement progressive reforms in a country ravaged by foreign capitalist interests. And there was simply no way to move toward equality and assert national sovereignty in Cuba without making the oppressor class feel persecuted. To wrap this point up with one more Lamrani quote, the stranglehold that US multinationals held over the Cuban economy was so strong that it became impossible to undertake any reforms without affecting their interests. And the US didn't only respond to the Cuban Revolution through economic means. The use of violence began almost immediately after Castro's government came to power. See, way before Eisenhower imposed the embargo in October of 1960, and even before the Mallory Memo of April 1960, some 30 bombing raids were already carried out against Cuba at the start of that year by US-based planes. So if you needed more proof that the US was the aggressor from the start, that they were never interested in striking a fair deal with Castro despite the fact that he was understood to be a reasonable man by US officials, then there you have it. But it gets worse. In April of 1961, a CIA-sponsored militia of Cuban exiles invaded Cuba in what was known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. The US government's goal here was to have these invaders attack the island, hopefully rally popular support, and trigger an uprising against Castro, form a provisional government, and give the US military the pretext it needed to intervene. This was a catastrophic failure, and the Cuban military was able to quell the attack within 3 days. A few months later, in November of '61, JFK, entirely humiliated by the defeat at the Bay of Pigs, authorized Operation Mongoose, a project to overthrow the Cuban government from within through sabotage, espionage, and assassination attempts. From setting fire to agricultural fields and sugar mills and engaging in biological warfare, to blowing up oil refineries and striking mines, the attacks levied against Cuba during this period were horrific. So much so that Lyndon B. Johnson can be quoted reminiscing on this period and complaining about it, saying, "We had been operating a damned murder inc. in the Caribbean." In February of 1962, John F. Kennedy decided to step it up a notch and dramatically escalated the economic warfare by transforming the existing sanctions into a blockade, banning all US exports to the island. He also moved to isolate Cuba internationally, pressuring US allies in NATO and in the Organization of American States to follow Washington's lead. This campaign of isolation eventually culminated in a sweeping regional embargo which had a devastating economic impact on Cuba. Cuba, however, managed to weather the storm by deepening its relationship with the Soviet Union and the broader communist bloc. Fearing an imminent US invasion in the wake of the Bay of Pigs attack, Operation Mongoose, and the ongoing economic warfare, Cuba agreed to host Soviet missiles in October of 1962. And honestly, if you or I were in Fidel Castro's position, we probably would have done the exact same thing. How many attacks have to be levied against you before you take serious measures to defend yourself? I bring up the Cuban Missile Crisis because critics of Cuba often point to it and completely rewrite the timeline, claiming that it was the catalyst for the embargo. You'll hear lines like, well, Cuba tried to destroy the world, of course we had to sanction them, which is barely even worth humoring. The missile crisis happened after years of US aggression toward Cuba had already begun. And crucially, the instigator wasn't Havana or the USSR. US nuclear missiles were stationed near the Soviet border in Turkey and Italy first. The Soviets simply matched that energy, but I digress. As mentioned earlier, things in Cuba were relatively good in the wake of the revolution and throughout the 70s and 80s. The country managed to blunt the worst effects of US-led economic warfare by trading with the communist bloc, and that relative stability created the conditions for Cuba to engage in acts of international solidarity. Take Angola, for instance. The Cuban military intervened to help the MPLA in its fight against the invading white supremacist forces of apartheid South Africa. And Cuba's support for the Angolan leftists was about more than just shared ideology. Cuba itself had been a slave society for centuries, and it carried a deep legacy of brutal racism prior to the revolution. The Cuban government viewed its support for Angola as a way of helping to right that historical wrong. Between 1975 and 1991, more than 300,000 Cubans volunteered to serve in Angola, and over 2,000 of them died. Though Western chauvinists often dismiss Cuba's role in Angola as nothing more than the actions of a Soviet proxy, The reality is the opposite. Cuba acted completely selflessly on its own initiative and didn't even inform the Soviet Union of its initial decision to deploy troops. What is understood to be the climax of the Angolan War is the Battle of Quito Cuanavale, where the South African forces tried to capture the town. In response, Castro sent military reinforcements, and the ensuing battle ended up being the largest military engagement on the African continent since World War II. The result of this battle, which historian Isaac Saney refers to as African Stalingrad, was the victory of Cuban and Angolan forces and the defeat of South Africa. The historical consequences of this South African loss were the independence of Namibia, which was under South African occupation, and the collapse of apartheid. As a show of gratitude for this massive Cuban sacrifice, Nelson Mandela, shortly after being released from prison, flew to Cuba to personally thank Fidel Castro and the Cuban people for their support against apartheid. We have come here today recognizing our great debt to the Cuban people. What other country has such a history of selfless behavior as Cuba has shown for the people of Africa? What country has ever needed help from Cuba and not received it? How many countries threatened by imperialism or fighting for their freedom have been able to count on the support of Cuba? Mandela said in his speech, illustrating the selflessness of the Cuban people. Unfortunately, in 1991, the Soviet Union fell and Cuba entered into an economic crisis known as the Special Period, which lasted until 2000. The US used this as an opportunity to ramp up economic warfare by implementing the Torricelli and Helms-Burton Acts. The Torricelli Act of 1992 banned foreign subsidiaries of US companies from trading with Cuba, penalized countries that aided Cuba, and prohibited ships that docked in Cuban ports from entering the US for 180 days. This effectively made it so that you would have to decide between trade with the US or Cuba, but not both. Many chose the much larger US market, obviously. This also effectively cut off food and medicine imports to Cuba. The Helms-Burton Act of 1996 codified the embargo and made it so that no US president could remove it without congressional approval, and it penalized foreign companies that used property in Cuba, making it so that they could be sued in US courts. This was designed to prevent investment and trade with Cuba and cut it off from the outside world, even going so far as to leverage the US's influence over international financial institutions to make it so that Cuba could not be granted credit. So for those who like to downplay and lie about the blockade and claim that it's merely the US exercising its right to refrain from trade with Cuba, fuck you, you're a liar. This blockade breaches international law. It imposes US laws and political demands onto other sovereign nations to stop them from trading with Cuba, asserting American dominance over the island for no reason other than Cuba's insistence on upholding its national sovereignty, which it has the internationally recognized right to do. You tell me whether a country as altruistic as Cuba, one that has shown time and time again that it stands with the downtrodden of this world no matter where they are, deserves this. But let's get back to showcasing Cuba's selflessness. Specifically, its medical internationalism. Since 1960, more than 400,000 Cuban medical professionals have served in 164 countries. By the mid-1990s, Cuba had more doctors working abroad than the World Health Organization itself. In 2005, Cuba sent workers to Pakistan in the wake of an earthquake and treated 75% of the victims. After Haiti's 2010 earthquake, Cuban doctors acted immediately. And after Ebola broke out in West Africa in 2014, Cuba was the first nation to respond with a medical contingent. In collaboration with Venezuela, Cuba launched Operation Miracle in 2004, where free eye surgery was given to low-income individuals across Latin America. And by 2019, it had restored vision to over 4 million people in 34 countries, entirely free of charge. Between 1990 and 2011, even during its own economic crisis, Cuba treated over 20,000 Chernobyl victims, free of charge. In 1999, it established the Latin American School of Medicine and trained students from impoverished communities all over the world, including from the very country that had been sabotaging it, the US. And Cuba did this, you guessed it, free of charge on the condition that those who received an education would serve their communities. By 2019, almost 30,000 doctors from 105 countries had graduated. As Castro said in a 2003 speech, Cuba does not drop bombs on other people. Cuba does not possess nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, or biological weapons. Our country's tens of thousands of scientists and doctors have been educated in the idea of saving lives. I once said that we could not and would never carry out preventive or surprise attacks against any dark corner of the world, but rather, our country could send needed doctors to the darkest corners of the world. Doctors, not bombs. Doctors, not smart weapons. There's something somewhat remarkable about a country whose history has been defined by fending off aggression for centuries, and then once it finally achieves a sense of stability, immediately turns to helping those in need, no matter where they are, even in the empire that seeks to destroy it. And even as it suffered its own economic crisis after the dissolution of the USSR, it kept going and continued to aid those who needed it most. By the mid-2000s, Cuba had bounced back from the special period, in part thanks to a lucrative economic arrangement between Cuba and the new Venezuelan government headed by Hugo Chavez, who supplied Cuba with the oil it needed in exchange for doctors. And for the next little while, Cuba was doing all right. It wasn't really until Trump, who in his first term added an additional 200+ sanctions on the country, and later, COVID, which destroyed Cuba's tourism industry, that the island began to really suffer again. Which brings us to the modern day, where Trump's genocidal strangulation of the island can really only be understood as collective punishment, though the economic warfare levied against Cuba has always been a form of collective punishment, let's be real. But at the time of this recording, Cuba is running out of oil, which it desperately needs to function, while the US threatens any country that decides to help. I don't know what's in store for Cuba, but if history shows us anything, it's that the Cuban people are extremely resilient, adaptive, and steadfast in the face of foreign aggression. They always have been. Let this video exist to highlight the selflessness and durability of the Cuban people, who have shown that when you structure a society around the well-being of all and not just profits for the few, you can not only improve the lives of those domestically, but inspire change throughout the world. If you want to see more anti-Cuba propaganda refuted, such as the lies about Che Guevara being a mass murderer or the claims that Fidel and co. had concentration camps for gay people, check out this video of mine. I also have a weekly podcast where we talk about current and historical events and occasionally bring on some great guests. We did an episode on Cuba not too long ago if you want to check that out. Huge thanks to my patrons on Patreon for making these high-quality videos possible, and a special written thank you to my top-tier patrons. If you want access to my scripts and source material in an organized format, along with other perks, consider becoming a patron. Thanks.